Well, howdy everyone, it's me again, and I've finally caved in to people's requests for a review of Sigma's new 17 to 70mm f2.8 to f4 APS-C macro lens. This lens is for APS-C digital cameras only, so those of you with expensive full-frame or film cameras should look elsewhere. The lens can be found for a little over £300, which seems maybe a tiny bit expensive. Sigma have been making these kinds of 17 to 70mm lenses for a long time now. This C version, which stands for Contemporary, don't ask me why, is the latest one of this popular design. The idea behind these 17 to 70mm lenses is quite handy. They're like a super version of your camera's kit lens. They give you a little more zoom range, as you can see here, 17mm being slightly wider than 18mm and zooming all the way into 70mm, which is a little tighter than 55mm. Both lenses get darker as you zoom in though, which is not very helpful for video work. As well as having a better zoom range, this Sigma lens also gives you a wider aperture, letting in almost twice as much light as the standard kit lens. This can give you snappier pictures, especially shooting indoors or in a dark, and also giving you slightly more out of focus backgrounds. For example, at 55mm, your typical kit lens can give you an aperture of f5.6, which gives you a slightly blurry background, as you can see here. However, the Sigma lens at 55mm can have an aperture of f4, which gives you this background, which is twice as blurry, giving your photography a bit more depth. However, it's not the biggest difference in the world. I mean, here's the same picture taken with my 50mm f1.4 lens. Now that's a real narrow depth of field. This lens can also focus extremely closely to your subject, even right up to the front lens element. This macro capability can give you some fun photos, although your subjects will be quite dark, as they're under the shadow of the lens itself. Another feature is that the lens has quite effective and almost silent optical stabilization. Here's some footage with it turned off and now turned on. It works well, but the image is still slightly jittery and it doesn't handle tilting and panning in the smoothest way, so the optical stabilization will be better for still photography than video work. Essentially, Sigma's 17 to 70mm lenses are for people who are reasonably happy with what their kit lens can do, but who want a little extra reach in their zoom range and a bit more light reaching their camera's sensor. Let's look at build quality. Sigma's new Global Vision style of lenses has had amazing build quality so far, and while this lens sits a bit more in the value category, it's still pretty well put together. It's very nice and small, almost as small as a kit lens, although it weighs a lot more. Here you can see it on a Canon 70D, but it would balance well on almost any camera. The lens's zoom ring is smooth, but really quite stiff, which makes things a bit awkward when you're doing video work. The lens extends quite far as you zoom in. The focus ring works loosely and precisely, but it only turns about 45 degrees, which is quite fiddly. There's no full-time manual focus, so you shouldn't try to turn the ring when the lens is set to autofocus. It's a pretty old-fashioned approach these days, but not a major problem. It's not a helpful focus ring for video work. The lens's autofocus is not particularly fast, but it is very quiet, as you can hear here. It tested fairly accurately on my Canon 70D, although sometimes it would completely miss and you'd get a blurry picture. Some people may want to see how well the autofocus works when video making on one of Canon's newest cameras. Here's a quick test on my Canon 70D. As you can see, it's not amazingly fast, and you can quite clearly hear the lens's autofocus motor constantly micro-adjusting. You can also hear that clicking if you've attached an external microphone. So this is a good example of why Canon's new STM lenses are so much better for video work. Overall, the build quality of the lens is nice, and I love how small it is, so it might make a good travel lens. But sadly, it's a bit flawed as a lens for video work. The zoom ring is stiff, the focus ring is fiddly, the autofocus motor makes noise micro-adjusting, and the aperture gets darker as you zoom in. However, none of that is so terrible if you're just doing still photography, so still photographers will be happy. Okay, let's look at the all-important picture quality. I'm testing this lens on a new Canon 70D with its 20 megapixel APS-C sized sensor. Let's start at the widest angle of 17mm, with the aperture wide open at f2.8. The middle of the image is fantastically sharp, with good colours and contrast. However, as we look into the corners, the situation couldn't be more different. We see a fair bit of softness and quite a lot of green and pink chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. Stop down to f4 for a mild improvement in those corners, and again at f5.6. Stop down to f8 and the corners become reasonably sharp, but the chromatic aberration remains. The middle of the image remains brilliant. So at 17mm we see awesomeness in the middle of the image, but pretty weak corners. Let's zoom in halfway to 35mm. The maximum aperture has now darkened to f3.5. When we look right into the middle of the image, we see excellent, if not quite perfect, sharpness. Again, in the corners we see a bit of a soft image, but at least there's no chromatic aberration this time. Stop the lens down to f5.6 for better clarity, and at f8, the sharpness and general image quality is good in the corners and perfect in the middle of the image. So at 35mm the lens is still a bit soft in the corners, but the quality in the middle of the image is brilliant, and there's no longer any chromatic aberration. Finally, let's zoom in all the way to 70mm. Now the maximum aperture is f4. The picture quality is very sharp indeed in the middle of the image, although you can get very slightly sharper than this. Sharpness in the corners of the image is a little better than at wider angles, being usably sharp at f4. Stop down to f5.6 and the picture becomes very sharp, and even better at f8. The middle of the image is even sharper. So overall, the Sigma lens always gives a brilliant performance in the middle of the image frame, with plenty of good colours and contrast. At wider angles, the image quality is disappointingly soft in the corners, and there's very strong chromatic aberration at 17mm, which is pretty annoying. Stop the lens down to f8 when you need the best picture quality. It's not a bad performance, but other lenses like Sigma's 17 to 50mm f2.8 OS can be a lot sharper. Let's look at distortion and vignetting. At 17mm we see typical levels of strong barrel distortion, so nothing better than average for a zoom lens here. With the aperture at f2.8 you can see a little vignetting or dark corners, but it's not particularly bad. Stop the lens down to f4 for much brighter corners. The distortion levels straighten out when you zoom in to about 25mm, and at 70mm we can see slight pincushion distortion, but again nothing too bad. Even with the aperture wide open at f4, vignetting in the corners isn't too pronounced, so at least we can say that the vignetting is nicely under control. As I mentioned before, the lens can focus extremely closely. The close-up image quality is very soft when the aperture is wide open at f4. Stop down to f5.6 though for a massive improvement in sharpness and contrast, and things are even better at f8. However, you can see some rather extreme blue and red chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. The macro feature of this lens is really fun, and it can be useful. But if you're serious about macro photography, you should probably get a proper macro lens. The lens isn't particularly great at working against bright lights, displaying quite a bit of lens flare and a bit of a loss of contrast too. Finally, let's look at the bokeh, or the quality of the autofocus backgrounds. The lens doesn't give you the most out-of-focus backgrounds in the world, but when you do get them, the out-of-focus areas are very nice and soft, which is typical for a Sigma lens. Overall, if you're just doing still photography, then the Sigma 17 to 70mm C is a fun, versatile and useful little lens, potentially being a good travel lens. It may not be the sharpest lens in the world, but the middle of your images will always look brilliant. Despite its shortcomings, the lens is actually really nice to use, and I've enjoyed testing it to put this video together. However, the lens is not very suitable for video work for a number of reasons I've already mentioned. Now, a number of people have been asking me if they should get this lens or Sigma's slightly older 17 to 50mm f2.8 OS lens. That's a slightly tricky question as they're quite similar in a lot of ways. They both have very similar build quality, and their autofocus and optical stabilization systems work almost the same. The main difference is that the newer 17 to 70mm lens obviously has a better zoom range, and it can focus much closer for macro pictures. But the 17 to 50mm keeps its f2.8 maximum aperture as you zoom in, letting in twice as much light again. Ultimately, I personally always prefer the lens with a wider aperture because I love low light photography as well as getting blurry backgrounds in my pictures. More importantly for some people, the older 17 to 50mm lens is also considerably sharper. So personally, even though the 17 to 70 is nice and versatile, I'd probably go for the 17 to 50mm f2.8 and just get my telephoto lens out when I need to zoom in a bit more. But as always, it swings and roundabouts, so have fun deciding which lens is best for you.